Thomas Paine's story begins in 1737, when he was born to a Quaker father and an Anglican mother in Thetford, England. He had a rather hard life. Growing up, people would call him and his father corset makers as slander. He worked as an excise officer, collecting taxes and catching smugglers, but he wasn't very good at that job, or any of his other jobs for that matter. And to make things even worse, both his wife and child died during childbirth in 1760. In 1772, he published his first political work, an article called The Case of the Officers of Excise, which defended higher pay for excise officers. 2 years later, he was fired from the excise office. Soon after, he met Benjamin Franklin and moved to Philadelphia. In 1775, he became an editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine. He started anonymously publishing political articles, and one of his early works were called African Slavery in America, which was an article against slavery, and it was signed under the name Justice and Humanity. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, he argued that America shouldn't just rebel against taxes, but that they should separate from England altogether. He expressed these ideas in his most famous work, a 50-page pamphlet called Common Sense, which was printed on January 10, 1776. Instead of using philosophical references in Latin terms, like many writers did at the time, Thomas used biblical references to connect with the colonists. Common Sense sold about 150,000 copies, and it paved the way for the soon-to-be-written Declaration of Independence. Common Sense made a great impact on colonial America by encouraging people to participate in the Revolution. Before it was published, even leaders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson opposed the Revolution. Months after Common Sense was published, the Declaration of Independence was written, and later the Revolutionary War began. During the war, Thomas continued to encourage independence, and he even wrote the crisis papers to motivate George Washington's soldiers in the army. He was named Secretary of the Committee for Foreign Affairs in 1777, but then was expelled in 1779. After his expulsion, he worked as a clerk of the General Assembly of Pennsylvania, where he was inspired to write Public Good, a pamphlet expressing ideas of a government under a national constitution. In 1781, America won the war, and Thomas moved back to England 6 years later. In England, he found out about the French Revolution and started to actively support it by rallying and publishing documents. He even published a document while in prison. Around 1803, he returned to America, only to find that most of his work had been forgotten, and that his status had significantly decreased. He died 6 years later in 1809, and unfortunately, he had such little respect at the time that his obituary in the New York Citizen read, "He had lived long, did some good, and much harm." Not only did Thomas Paine write a document that is super important to the foundation of America, but he encouraged independence throughout the colonies and even throughout France. He also helped introduce the idea of a constitution for the U.S. to be ruled under. Even though he was mostly forgotten at the time of his death, his work lives on and is often acknowledged when discussing colonial America and the uprising of the American Revolution.